Welcome to DIY Dad. We recently decided to take on a rather ambitious project and to redo the vinyl in our boat. As you can see from this picture, it's kind of a dull brown color, and we decided to fix it because it needed some repair, and also we didn't like the colors so much, so we're going to redo the colors and make it something that we like a little bit more. When we started to think about doing this, we knew we needed a different sewing machine that could handle doing thicker vinyl, and we looked around and came up with the Sailrite Fabricator. Now, Sailrite has several different sewing machines, so it probably would have worked just fine, but the Fabricator seemed to be the machine that we would like the most. It had a long swing arm, it had a lot of power, and there was a lot to like about the Fabricator, and so we ended up going with the Fabricator. Now, I purchased this machine and it came the other day, and we're going to talk about unboxing and setting it up and how that went. Now, before you get started putting this Fabricator together, you need to bring together quite a few tools, actually. You need a tape measure, a pencil, an awl, a drill, and a 5/32 drill bit, a socket set with a 3/4 socket, 11/16, 9/16, 1/2, 3/8, 5/16, 12 millimeters, and 10 millimeters. I also found that I needed some wrenches, a 9/16 and a 10 millimeter wrench, also an Allen wrench set, a screwdriver, both Phillips and flathead, a hammer, a level, a speed square, and then a normal adjustable wrench. You're also going to need a decent amount of time to put this together. I am fairly competent when it comes to using tools and reading instructions and putting things together, and it took me about 3.5 hours to put it together. And that's a significant amount of time, but you will want to take that much time and put it together well. So the Fabricator came in 3 separate boxes. The big one is the sewing machine, and this thing is heavy. It weighs about 85 pounds, and you'll want to be prepared when you pick that up. As you open it up, you'll see that they did a very good job packing it, putting it together. There's tape on the seams, and there's staples on the seams as well. And once you get inside the first box, you'll see that there's a second box. And this is all for the safety of the sewing machine and putting it together so that they can ship it and not have any issues with that. As you open it up, you'll have some samples on top, and those samples were actually sewn by your individual sewing machine. And you can see there's several thick layers there, and you can check out the stitches and everything as you desire, but it's kind of fun that they put some samples in that your sewing machine actually sewed. Now on the top, as you pull it out, there's some various bags full of parts and pieces. This next piece is the bobbin winder. We'll be installing all that a little later. That's the oil that we'll be using as it's a self-lubricating machine. And that other is the balance wheel. And here's the machine. Oh, there's a thread stand. And then the actual machine. Now this is heavy, and you may need help pulling it out of the box. Be prepared to lift something that's 80 pounds. And there she is. She will be very lubricated. There's a lot of oil on it, and you will want to take a rag and wipe off the outside if you're not wanting that oil all over you and all over your projects. And then the oil pan that goes underneath the Fabricator, and we'll show you how that's installed here in a bit. Now, Sailrite does recommend that you save the box in case you ever have to ship the machine back to them, so I will be doing that, and I will keep that box with all the styrofoam that goes with it. And this box has some other parts and pieces, and it has the motor in it. It also, I'm looking for the manual so that I can put it together. That's the motor, and then there's 2 boxes of parts, and one of them will have the instruction manual, and then a couple of the cross braces for the stand that does come with the Fabricator. And that one just has the drawer. And this one has the bag of goodies that has the instruction manual in it. And that little one is the instruction manual, as you can see. It is full color pictures, which is extremely helpful in putting things together and in operating your sewing machine and doing any troubleshooting that you may need to do. This next box is the stand legs. And they did tie them together very tightly, which is good for their protection. Now that brown bag in the middle there is the treadle foot, and it is stuck in there very well. And I was playing with it a little bit and figured out that you have to loosen the bolts and pull the foot stand or the legs apart in order to get that treadle foot out. And that's a 3/4 inch socket on those stand bolts. Once you take those out, you can separate it and then pull out the treadle foot. Now when I put this back together, I actually put the top on backwards, but I figured that out in a later step and corrected it. And at this point, there's really no point in tightening those all the way down, since we will be adjusting that at a later point in the build. And the last box is a tabletop, and they recommend that you cut open one end, as I'm going to do here. And then open it up, and while you're grasping it firmly so that it doesn't slide out, flip it over and rest it on the floor, and then pull the box up over the tabletop. It is quite heavy, so do be aware that it's a very thick wood tabletop. There we have it. I have separated the hardware out, and we've got the legs ready. And the first thing we have to do is put the back support on. Now these are the 3/4 inch bolts and washers. Then they have a square washer for the inside, which allows you to tighten it without needing a secondary ratchet or wrench. And at this point, you don't want to tighten it up super tight, because you got to put them both on, and then we've got to square the whole thing. Again, that's a 3/4 inch socket that we're using here. So again, in this step, you do not want to over tighten these bolts, as you need to move the whole system and square it up later. Okay, so after you've done that, we've got to put the treadle crossbar on. So we'll flip it over so it's upside down, since the treadle bar goes on the bottom. And it sits right on top of those. Now these are put on with carriage bolts. The carriage bolt head is going to face up when the stand is sitting correctly on the ground. So in this orientation, it goes from the bottom up. And the carriage bolt, the square part of the head of the carriage bolt, will fit nicely in the groove on the stand legs. And you will want to make sure that that square part goes in those. If you get it off, you can bend those and it'll look bad. Now I'm just putting these in loosely, and then I will tighten them down after I get it in where I want it. And you'll notice those are slotted holes. You can move that treadle crossbar kind of wherever you want. And there's two different locations. You can have it closer to the front of the stand or closer to the back of the stand. I put it closer to the front in this step. And again, I'm not tightening super tight. I'm just getting a little bit of torque on them. And then as I get it all lined up there at the end, I'll tighten them down a little bit more. Now, when I tighten those up in this step, you do not want it so tight that you deform the metal, but you do want it tight enough that things won't move. So, especially when you're using a ratchet, you got to be kind of careful with that. Okay, now we got to deal with squaring it up. And I have a speed square here, and if you hold it against those bars, you can see where it's square or not. You do want to take your time with this. It can be rather tricky to force it in, as this is a metal stand and there's a lot going on with the different pieces and components, but you do want to make sure and get this square. Once you get it square there, you'll take your 3/4 socket and really tighten that back piece, that back part down. And do make sure you do both sides, as the legs are independent of each other. Just squaring one side is not going to be enough. And then once you do get it square and straight, you want to really tighten this one down. Now we have to measure out the marks to install the legs to the tabletop, and you can use a typical tape measure for this. I have an adjustable square, and that is my preferred method, as it allows me to be faster and more accurate, honestly. So you go in 1.5 inches from the back, and you'll mark that, and then you'll go to where the other leg will be, and I'm going to make a longer mark because it can vary a little bit more than the other side. And then you'll adjust that to 1/2 inch, and on the side with the notch where the hole is close to the side, you'll do a 1/2 inch mark all the way down that side. And then you'll take your tabletop and you'll put it on those marks that we just made. Slide it right to the edge and then right to the back, and make sure that you're along those lines the whole way. And then once you have it in the right location, then you need to mark those slots with a pencil. So make sure that you're holding this down tight so it doesn't move as you're marking with a pencil. This is a pretty important step, so take your time and make sure you do it right. Now make sure as you go from one leg to the other that they don't move, or you'll either be stretching this apart or pushing it together, and you don't want to do that. You want it to remain square as you squared it up in the previous step. Now we're going to drill a 5/32 inch hole right in the middle of of all four of those slots. Now, you can't go through the tabletop in this step. You have to take precautions in order to do that. So I have a method to create a stop, and it's pretty simple. Just take some tape, and I go up about a 1/2 inch on the drill bit, and then I will take the tape and wrap it around at that point, and that just shows me where to stop drilling. So just right in the middle of these slots, drill down to your tape mark, 1/2 inch deep, in all four locations. Then we can replace the legs, and we're going to put those on with some bolts with a washer. So regular lock washer, and the bolt, and the lock washer, of course, goes right against the bolt. Now, you could use a drill to put these in. It's a little bit tricky with the access there. It's 3/8 inch socket. I just decided that was the best method for me. I was able to cinch it down pretty quickly, like pretty coarse thread on the bolts, so it worked out pretty well. As you can see, I do start them by hand. Since you have a pilot hole that we drilled in the previous step, you can pretty easily get it started and then take over with the ratchet. And as long as they're in the right spot, you can actually tighten these down pretty tight. You do not want to pull it through the wood, as you can do that, but you can go ahead and cinch them down pretty tight. So once I got it on, I went back and cinched them down pretty tight. Now we're going to put the drawer on. Now the drawer is kind of just a by feel thing. I lined it up with the front of the desk a little bit back so that it was in a location that I liked. And if you have tape around it as it comes packaged, you've got to remove that or you won't be able to do this step. You take the guide rails from the side, and the holes go against the wood and the notch goes against the drawer, and you'll just line that up and then make sure that it's in the location that you want. And I slid them all the way forward because there's some detents in the plastic, and I want the drawer to stop right where I've got it. Now I'll take an awl, and in 3 of the locations I will press that awl into the wood so that I know where to put the screws. They only provide 3 screws even though there's 4 holes, so just pick the 3 you want. Make sure you get the front one and the back one. The middle one doesn't matter nearly as much. And as you push that awl down into the wood, it will provide a better start for your screws. You're not going to do a pilot hole on these because you would need a super tiny drill bit as the screws are quite small. I had to change the drill bit size. I had a typical number 2 and I ended up going with a smaller drill bit in order to grip the heads of these screws as they were pretty small. And if you over tighten these to the wood, then the drawer might not slide. You do want them tight, but you don't want them so tight that the drawer doesn't move. I'm just making sure that I actually hit my hole. You do want to do that. If you get these in the wrong spot, you'll have a drawer that will frustrate you for the life of the table. Got it in. Slides rather well. Now this step we have some rubber feet that we have to put on the legs. These rubber feet all come in a bag and they're all identical, so it doesn't matter which one goes where. And they just slip right on the feet. There is a slot they have to go in, so you do have to deform them to get it over, but they are designed to do that and they fit rather well after you do that. Now we're going to flip the table over and get it to the correct height that we want. Now it is heavy. You may want to have a helper. I'm not sure how much it weighs in this step, but it's probably 50 pounds. So 3/4 inch ratchet, and these are the same bolts that we took out earlier to remove the treadle foot. We're going to take them all out and determine how high we want this table. I want it about as high as that plastic table next to it, and it worked out rather well for that. In order to adjust it, you do need to take out all four, as it's put together pretty tightly, so you will have to remove all four bolts in order to do that. Now, because of that, you will need a helper to adjust the table height. You can probably do it by yourself. I found that to be rather frustrating, and so I got a little helper. So we lifted it up, and I needed his help to hold that up, and then I put it in the slot so that the top of the tabletop legs rested right against a slotted hole that they have. And so I was able to get it in there, and then I don't have to worry about it sliding up and down, even if I don't tighten it super well, because it's at the top of that slot. Now again, you don't want to do these crazy tight yet until you adjust everything, and we'll be leveling it as well. So you just want it tight enough. Okay, so now we've got them all in, and at this point, we're going to tighten them just a little bit, and then we're going to level the tabletop. So now we're checking the level, and this one, even though I thought I put it in the right stops and everything, it is not level, so I need to adjust it. It's quite level side to side, but front to back it's not. So we're going to loosen the bolts and try to pull up the back and then tighten it down. Now I found this to be rather difficult, as it's quite stiff at this point. So I'm holding down with my knee on the bottom one and pushing up on the back, trying to get some movement so that I can tighten it when it is level. Okay, on this one we're going to install the treadle bar, and there's several bits of hardware here, and there's a couple of support brackets. So to do this, we're flipping the table on its back so that we have full access to the bar that we install the treadle to. So the supports have pins on them, and those pins need to face each other. The bolt heads will go on the top. So put the bracket with the bolt, then put the washer and the nut, and we want these really, really loose at this point. You want them flopping around. So skip 4 holes, and then we put the other one in the 5th. And again, you want these very, very loose. In fact, even finger tightening them, they're going to be too tight. Make sure you have the holes in the back that face towards the back of the table. And then there's holes in the side of the treadle, and you put the posts on the attachment brackets in those holes. And you can see I've got it too tight because I need those brackets to be a little more floppy for me. So I'm going to loosen it up and be able to lean that bracket back just a little bit until I can get it in the support for the treadle. Just like that. And then you can finger tighten these up and make sure that everything's in the right location and that the treadle moves the way you want it to. And this is going to be 9/16 socket, 9/16 wrench, and tighten those things down. Now verify the treadle moves. It does, so we're good. Flip the table back up. And then there's a bracket that we put on the back of the treadle that holds on to the control arm that attaches to the motor. So these are 10mm bolts. We're going to put these on. I'm just hoping at this point that it's in the right location, knowing that I'll probably have to move it. But once I get the motor on, I don't want to be tipping the table on its back a whole lot, so I'm going to guess that this is in the right spot at this point. So 10mm wrench, 10mm socket, hold one end, tighten the other. You can tighten these as much as you want, but just realize you may have to move them in a later step. Now that we have the treadle installed, we're going to open up the motor, the workhorse motor. It comes in its own separate box. It has its own instruction manual showing you how to install the various components of it. It comes with its own treadle control rod and some various parts and pieces. It comes all encased in foam, and you'll have to open up the foam. It's taped together, so you'll need to cut it open. You could find the end and pull it around too, but I found it easier just to cut the plastic. And there you have the motor. It has the hardware, and with the hardware, we need to take the carriage bolts and put 2 of them through the top of the table. There's 3 holes there, and we're just going to do the 2 that are shown. And you take those and pound them down into the table. If you don't do this, they'll come back up or they'll twist. And if you pound them down in there, they'll set themselves, which is what you want. So we'll take those. We'll also get the nut and washer ready. It is a washer, lock washer, and a nut, and we'll just put those on loosely on these two bolts. We don't want to go very far at this point because we're going to slide on the motor housing, but we will start them. With those started, we'll uncover the motor, and you can see from the way it mounts, there's two slots on one end, and you want to put those two slotted holes into the bolts as shown here. And it should just hang there, but I will also tighten up those nuts just a little bit to hold it in place. You don't want to do them too tight because we do need to adjust this motor and get it in the right spot after we install all of these carriage bolts. Now as you install this third one, you do want to make sure that that third slot is lining up with the hole. You don't want to just start pounding on that carriage bolt with it possibly hitting into the engine mount. I made sure it was in the slot and then pounded it in. Okay, now I didn't do those tight because we do need to adjust the motor. You can see it needs to line up with that slot. And in order to do that, I've got to adjust that motor, but we need to put the fitting that goes on the end to hold the belt on there first so that we know where it needs to be. In order to install that fitting, the gear drive does come with two, one that's got teeth in it and one that doesn't. We definitely want the one with teeth because that matches up with our Fabricator sewing machine. And there's a small metal key that holds that in place, and there's a little slot on the drive, and you need to put that key in that drive, and that's what will hold the gear in place. So we'll slide this one in there. Ours fit really well. We didn't need to touch it up or sand it or anything. Just pushed it in by hand, and then take that gear drive and line up the key slot and shove it in. All the way in is where you want it. Now we have a washer, lock washer, and a nut, and this is actually a locking nut. It's got a nylon piece in it to lock it in place. There's also a couple of set screws with an Allen wrench that you can do. You don't need them. I will tighten them down here, but we're going to install the nut first. You don't have to do this super tight. You just need to be able to hold it in place. So you want to engage the lock washer and make sure it's snug down, and then you're good. You will have to hold the gear drive here or it will spin on its own, and you don't want it to spin. Just like that, got it nice and snug down. Now this, like I said, this step is not really necessary, but you do take a Allen wrench and you can either take those out or you can screw them all the way in. I chose to screw them in. The added locking mechanism won't hurt anything. Now the machine came with one control rod and the motor came with the other. I'm going to use the longer one, and it actually helped later in some of the adjustments, so I would recommend using the longer one. Now on these control rods, they have two nuts and a washer, and to install those you want to take out the nut and the washer, leave one of the other nuts on, and then when you install it in to the motor control, put the washer and the nut back on. And you will want to snug these down pretty good after you get it all installed, but there's a lot of adjustment that's necessary here. And you can install the lower one that goes on the treadle. You can put it on from right to left or left to right, however works best to line up with the bar coming down from the motor control. So it's important to install the one on the motor control first and then adjust whatever you need to make it line up with the foot. So there it lines up really nicely, and then you can put the locking mechanism on, and the two bars will slide next to each other. And once you get that on, you'll need to tighten that nut, the bolt down that holds those two together. You want to tighten that down pretty good. It just relies on friction to hold those together. Once you have the treadle all the way in the up position, you'll want to snug that nut down. That's a 1/2 inch socket to tighten that down. That'll need to be pretty tight so that it doesn't slip, because that's just friction holding everything together. Now 10mm socket to tighten up the smaller nuts that go on the treadle and the motor control. I needed to use a 10mm wrench to hold those in place and make sure they were both tight. Now as you push on the treadle, it will engage that control arm, and you want it so that when the treadle's up, the control arm is all the way to its highest position. Next we're going to install the oil pan. It fits right in that hole. It really only goes one way. That control arm goes in the front. There's rubber feet that you need to put on all the corners. You can see the cutouts in the tabletop where each of those go. Once you get those on the corners, you can just drop it right in there. They are going to fit tight. You will have to push, specifically those frontward ones, you will have to push those in pretty hard. You want them down so they're as close to flush as you can get them, so you want to push them all the way down. Now these others are for the hinges on the sewing machine. The rubber can go in just like this. You want to keep the hinges out because you're going to put those in the sewing machine later, but you can put the rubber parts in the cutouts. Now in the pan, we need to install this plastic piece, and that's actually what controls the lift of the foot later. And then inside the bobbin bag, we have a little magnet, and we need to drop that magnet kind of in a low spot. That is to pick up any metal shavings while you're running your machine. And then there's a machine support here, and this is for when you tilt the machine back, that needs to rest on there, and you want that. Now grab the machine, bring it over to the table, and be prepared. It is 80 pounds, so it's heavy. We'll take those hinges, put them in the holes. And then we'll lift up the machine and set it right in the hole at where the hinges line up. The hinges will go right in those rubber pieces that we laid out earlier. There's nothing that goes in to create a hinge line or anything. They just kind of sit in there, and you won't need that. The machine weighs enough, they'll stay in there. Now we need to check and make sure the motor goes the right way. So we'll plug it in, make sure the power's on, slowly push down the treadle and make sure it spins counterclockwise. Then we'll unplug it and go to the next step. Now we need to put on the motor guard. There's several screws here that we're going to remove. You may want to do this with a screwdriver. I feel pretty comfortable with my drill, doing it very slow. You do not want to strip these screws out. You take out all four. You won't use all four of them right away, but you will need to take out all four eventually. I'm going to leave that last one in. Then you'll line this up with the holes and put the screws back in. To get these started, this may require a screwdriver so that you can line them up and get them started. Now don't tighten these all the way up because you do need to line up all three of these holes at the same time. So you'll just get them started and then get all of them in. And you don't want to do this too tight because it is plastic, so just snug them down so it doesn't move and call it good. Now take the balance wheel, pull out the posi pin, and then this is a left-hand nut, so you spin it the wrong way to turn it off, and then put the balance wheel back on and do a left-hand tight on that nut and snug it down pretty good. We're just going to stick the posi pin in the middle so that can spin without controlling the needle and having the needle move. Now we need to also install the belt guard on the motor. So there's some small screws that came with, and you're just going to line up those slots and put in those screws one by one. So we want to make sure and line up that belt guard so that it kind of faces the right direction, so the belt goes through the square end opening. And just tighten that down, not overly tight, but we don't want it to come out. There are lock washers that go with it, so you just tighten them down a little bit and call it good. And after that, we need to put the belt on. So the belt goes on up at the top, and the teeth of the belt go right into the balance wheel. And then we go underneath and we're going to tilt the machine back because it won't just go over the motor. So rock the machine back, go over the gear wheel on the motor. Just like that. And then rock it forward. Now you want the tension to be just right. You want to push on the belt and it should move about 3/8 of an inch is all. You don't want it too tight, but you do want it tight. And as you spin the balance wheel, it should self-spinner over the teeth, and you can see that it wants to move to the outside, so we need to move the motor the other direction so that it centers the belt over those teeth. So we're going to loosen the motor and slide it and see if we can balance and see if we can line up that belt. We moved it, it's good. Now we're going to put on the rest of the guards after we got our belt centered. This bottom guard just slides over the top of the other one. There's some rails and they just fit right on the other one, and there's a screw hole on the bottom, so we'll slide that on. Make sure that the belt doesn't touch it anywhere, and this one it doesn't. And then we'll put the screw that came with right in the bottom, and we can just tighten that up. And the top one, there's a slot that it goes in. There's a piece, there's a notch on the machine, and you put that, it's actually from the other cover, so you'll line that up and slide it in. And then the bottom one, has a hole for the other screw. And that's the fourth one that we didn't pull out before, but I pulled it out in an intermediate step. We'll just put that in, make sure nothing's rubbing. And don't over tighten, just snug it down. Just like that, spin it, nothing's touching the belt, so we're set. The next part is installing the bobbin winder. In order to do that, you need to put it on the table and have an 1/8 of an inch gap between the belt and the wheel, and you want it lined up in a nice straight line. So if you look at it straight on, the wheel and the belt should be right in line with each other. So you're going to hold it down, make sure it doesn't move, and then mark the 2 slots at the front and at the back. And with the slots, after we drill the holes, we can adjust it back and forth. Now we're going to drill right in the middle of the slots. I think we're going to use a 5/32 drill bit. Now I still have my stop on my drill bit. I'm going to use that. Do not want to go too deep. In order to drill, just line it up right in the middle. I'm going to flip the machine back so that it's out of the way and so I can get access to where I need to drill those holes. It's a hard surface, so you want to make sure you go slow and don't slip off. You want to drill that hole right in the middle. Okay, put this back in place and grab the screws. In the instructions, there wasn't any instructions for which fasteners, so we're going to use these domed head with washers. They're not self-tapping, that's why we drilled the hole, so these are the ones we're going to use. Now with the drill, I'm not going to cinch them all the way down. I want to make sure it's in the right place before I tighten everything down. Go nice and slow so I don't strip anything out, and don't cinch it too tight. Flip the machine back over and make sure we're in line and we're 1/8 of an inch away from the belt. You engage it and check, make sure it hits, and it does. Now that I've verified where I need to be, I'll cinch them down, make them nice and tight, not too tight because we don't want to strip them out of the tabletop, so you got to be a little careful. Just need to make sure that that wheel is centered over the belt and adjust it just a little bit, and there we go. The next step is the thread stand. There's 2 long poles, one with thread on the end, that's the part that goes through the table, the other part goes on top of it. That's the one where the thread runs through, it has the guides, that's going to go up high. And the other one holds the thread, and it's going to be down low. So to install the hardware, you need to open the discs, take the metal poles, and you're going to shove those where the rounded end is, and you're going to shove those all the way through. And then you'll see some notches line up with the notch in both of the notches line up, and then you'll push that all the way in so that they're nice and snug. Now you're going to take off the nut and the washer and then install that to the thread stand. And you put on the foam. Then there's a thread centering piece, and you need to just slide that down over the pole. Just push it all the way down. Then we're going to tighten those in another step. So same thing on this one. All right, we've got the thread holder set up, and this is the piece that holds the two halves, the two vertical halves together. So we slide that on the top, then we'll tighten the bottom nut. It's a 5/16 ratchet and a screwdriver on the other side. There is a detent in there to hold it in place, but it's not very strong, so I found I needed to hold one side with the screwdriver and the other side with the ratchet. And in order to make sure this is very snug, it will require quite a bit of tightening. Take the top piece and, well, before we do that, we need to, of course, put on the thread holder before we put on that piece. So we need to take it off and put the thread holder on first. It just slides on, and then there's a nut to hold it. Again, it's a screw head and a nut. The nut has a detent. On this one, I was able to just use a screwdriver and get it to hold in place. Now that that's on, we can put the top piece in. There's a screw and a nut that goes in the top hole in order to hold the top pole to the center connection piece. Just make sure both of those are cranked down nice and tight so that you get a nice sturdy support. Now to put it on the table, there's a plastic piece on the bottom. Just slide that off, take off the nut, one washer, leave the rubber washer and the top metal washer on. Now there's a hole on the bench that it goes right into. Then on the underside, you'll put the washer on first and then the nut. And put the plastic cap on. And then take the rubber top off, slide on the thread guide. And there's your thread holder. Now we have to do the knee presser, the press foot lift. First thing you have to do is take the rubber pad and install it over the metal disc. There's a slot in there and you just want to shove the metal in the slot. You do have to deform it a little bit to get it in. But once it's in, it fits really well. And that's the rod that holds it, and it attaches to the rod that sticks out the front of the oil case. So the lock piece goes on the inside of that, and you put it up through the pole and tighten it down. We're going to do that right now. So we stick it in, make sure the holes align, and loosen the locking nut. See how the holes are lined up, and then right up over the rod. And then crank down the screw after we know where we want it. Up at the top, the screw I'm pointing to is the lock screw, and that's the only thing that holds the knee presser to the presser rod, and you have to crank that down very tight. After you adjust it to the right location, you want to really tighten that down. I'm going to cinch it down right now and then adjust it to where I need it a little bit later. And I'm doing that because in order to adjust the knee presser and make sure everything's adjusted correctly with how the foot lifts, I have to have it tight. So you want to take out all of the play with this. You want it to not move without the foot lifting or dropping. So we're going to adjust all that play out. So that's where it starts picking up the foot, and that's too far over. So we're going to adjust that so that it's in the right place. And when you do this, you want to make sure there's no fabric underneath the foot. I didn't do that here and ended up readjusting it again later, but you want to make sure there's no fabric under the foot. So then it's up and down right when it engages. And now I need to take out the slack. So there's some set screws underneath that we need to adjust. The one on the left, you adjust where it starts to pick up. And I'm going to take out all that slack. See how there's still slack there? I'm just trying to get all that slack out before I tighten up the nut. Almost there. And that's right where we want it. And to get them tight, I'll back off the set screw just a little bit and then thread up the nut and then tighten down the set screw so it's exactly where I want. Now you also want to adjust the other side so that it can't move too far. So there's one on the right side, and you loosen that up and you move it all the way up, and that's where you want it, right at that stop. Now I'm checking where the knee placement is, and it seems to work pretty good. I want the pad to be a little bit higher so that it hits my knee in the right location. And you need to adjust this to the location that you want. One of the last things that we do is to fill the machine with oil. So we got to tilt it back. And there's a mark that says low and high. And we need to put oil in so it's between the low and the high. And they give you the oil, and it's actually a perfect amount. And in my case, I could just dump the whole thing of oil in. Flip the machine back over. And you're ready to go. Your machine is set up. To turn it on, you just push the button on the front. And that's all there is. Thanks for watching. I'll have another video talking about my final setup and how I enjoy using the machine at a later date.